This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, setting the stage for aggressive development and potential king-side attacks. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, Black's most popular and aggressive response to e4, aiming to create an unbalanced pawn structure and fight for central control. Developing the knight to f3 is a principal move in the open Sicilian, controlling the d4 square and preparing for further central expansion while challenging Black's setup. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a complex and popular opening where Black immediately challenges White's central pawn and prepares to develop their pieces for active counterplay. This move, 3d4, directly challenges Black's central pawn control, opening lines and initiating the core tactical and strategic battles characteristic of the open Sicilian defense. This move initiates the open Sicilian, a sharp and complex battle where Black accepts the challenge of an immediate pawn exchange, aiming for an active game and often counterplay. This move initiates the open Sicilian, a sharp and dynamic variation where White gains a central pawn majority in exchange for a slightly less cohesive pawn structure. This move, challenging the central knight, is a common and principled response in the Sicilian defense, aiming to unbalance White's pawn structure and develop actively. This move maintains White's central pawn presence and prepares to develop the queenside pieces, continuing the standard development in the open Sicilian. This move transitions into the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to control the d5 square and prepare for the development of the dark-squared bishop. This aggressive pawn push on g4 in the Sicilian Najdorf variation is a sharp attempt to gain space and potentially disrupt Black's queenside development by creating an attack on the kingside. Developing the bishop to e7 solidifies the kingside and prepares for castling, while also indirectly challenging White's aggressive g4 pawn push. This aggressive pawn advance aims to drive the knight away from its centralizing square, potentially opening lines for attack while restricting Black's development and piece mobility. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, supporting potential central pawn breaks and preparing for kingside castling while avoiding the immediate pawn advance on the kingside. White aggressively expands on the kingside with h4, aiming to create further pawn storms and restrict Black's kingside development. This move, nc6, develops a piece and controls important central squares, preparing to challenge White's aggressive pawn push on the kingside. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the knight on d4 and preparing for kingside castling while also potentially aiming at the weakened Black kingside. This move prepares to challenge White's aggressive pawn advance on the kingside and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. This move strategically positions the queen to support a potential kingside pawn storm and prepares to castle queenside, creating attacking opportunities opposite Black's developing pieces. This move prepares to reinforce the d6 pawn and potentially connect the rooks, while also supporting a possible kingside pawn storm or e5 push. Castling queenside initiates an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, seeking to open lines against the Black king, which remains in the center and is vulnerable to attack. This move boldly challenges White's kingside pawn storm by initiating a counterattack on the queenside, aiming to exploit the vulnerable b2 pawn and open lines for Black's pieces. This move resolves White's knight being attacked and immediately challenges Black's central pawn majority, aiming to simplify into a more favorable endgame where White's space advantage can be exploited. This recapture on c6 develops the queen to a more active central square, supporting the knight on d7 and preparing to potentially contest the central pawn majority or support a kingside advance. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawns and potentially support a central pawn advance later. This pawn advance on b4 challenges the white bishop on d4, forcing it to move and potentially disrupting white's king safety plans, while also creating queenside space for black. This aggressive knight sacrifice aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's attack, while also forcing black to address immediate tactical threats. This pawn sacrifice on d5 by black is a critical decision to open lines against white's king and develop an attacking initiative, accepting a temporary material disadvantage for dynamic piece activity. This move sacrifices a bishop to open the g-file and target the opponent's castled king, initiating a sharp attack that requires precise calculation and a keen understanding of king safety. This move, sacrificing the g7 pawn, forces black to recapture with the rook, opening the g-file for white's rook and creating attacking chances along this newly opened line. This exchange aims to destabilize black's kingside and open lines for white's pieces after black's daring pawn sacrifice on d5. White's aggressive pawn push has opened lines but also created weaknesses, and black must now decide whether to maintain central tension or resolve the immediate threat to the queen while continuing development. This move develops the bishop to an active square, directly attacking the queen and indirectly putting pressure on the kingside pawn structure. This move repositions the knight to a strong outpost, simultaneously defending the pawn on d5 and preparing to attack the bishop on f6, creating a dynamic imbalance. This move sacrifices the bishop to remove black's knight on e5, disrupting black's coordination and opening the d-file for white's rook. This move recaptures the bishop, regaining material equality while opening the e-file for your rooks and creating a central pawn majority. This pawn thrust aggressively challenges black's king safety, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and create attacking chances on the kingside. This move re-establishes a piece on the key e5 square, aiming to contest the central light squares and prepare for potential pawn advances like f6. bh3 aims to trade off black's active bishop, simplifying the position and removing a key defender of the weakened dark squares around the black king. Capturing the bishop on h3 eliminates a key attacking piece, simplifying the position and removing white's dangerous initiative on the kingside. This rook sacrifice on h3 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines for attacking the king, capitalizing on the weakened kingside after black's recent exchanges. This move develops the rook to the open c-file, immediately contesting control and preparing to exert pressure on black's queenside. This move capitalizes on the open files created by the previous exchanges, aiming to break down black's king safety and exploit the weakness on e5. This move 22 qc4 strategically repositions the queen to attack white's weak pawn on d5 and simultaneously prepare to challenge the open c-file, aiming to neutralize white's aggressive pawn advances. This move repositions the rook to the third rank, potentially supporting a central pawn push or preparing to double rooks on the c-file to exert pressure on black's queenside pawn structure. This move, qf4+, forces the white king to move, preventing immediate kingside attacks and aiming to simplify the position while keeping black's queen active. This move prophylactically guards the c2 square, anticipating potential checks from black's queen or knight and preparing to consolidate white's position. This move activates the rook to the 4th rank, challenging white's queen and preparing to exploit the open c-file. This move creates a powerful passed pawn on d6, aiming to disrupt black's king safety and potentially open lines for white's attack. This move aims to activate the rook on the open e-file and potentially create counterplay by threatening the white king and the d6 pawn. This move repositions the rook to contest the open e-file and prepare for potential operations on the king side or in the center, while also potentially defending the 3rd rank. This exchange simplifies the material balance, clearing the d-file for white and opening lines for black's queen. But it allows black to improve the coordination of their remaining pieces. This move recaptures the piece, aiming to simplify the position and consolidate after the earlier exchange, but it also opens the d-file for black's rook. This move recaptures the pawn, but opens lines for white's pieces and allows them to attack the king more directly. This move prepares to recapture the sacrificed knight and activate the queen, potentially targeting white's weakened kingside while also defending against immediate threats. This recapture on g5 is necessary to remove white's active queen, but it neglects the important d6 pawn, which now becomes a dangerous passed pawn for white after the subsequent exchange. This move repositions the rook to defend the crucial e4 pawn and prepares to contest the open e-file, aiming to prevent black's queen from further infiltrating white's position. Black's queen actively re-engages on the 2nd rank, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially threaten the king's safety or create further tactical opportunities. This move aims to control the critical e5 square, centralize the queen for potential attacks, and prepare for further pawn advances or piece repositioning. This move repositions the rook to the g-file, preparing to contest it and potentially create threats against white's king on the weakened kingside, while also offering support for a potential pawn advance. This move activates the rook, preparing to challenge black's defensive setup and potentially create threats on the 1st rank or along the open file. This move aims to centralize the queen and prepare for potential exchanges on the d-file, while also defending the pawn on d5. This move is a decisive tactical blow, as it forces the exchange of queens and leaves white with a significant material advantage, transitioning the game to a winning endgame. The king's escape to e7 is forced to avoid immediate checks but creates significant weaknesses on the dark squares and places the king in a potentially vulnerable central position, limiting its defensive capabilities. This move aims to control the central dark squares, restrict black's king's mobility, and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside. The move prepares to advance the pawn to a5, aiming to create a passed pawn on the queenside and challenge white's central control. This check forces black's king to a more exposed square, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially initiate further attacks on the weakened kingside. This move tucks the king away from the dangerous open files and the attacking queen, prioritizing safety after the aggressive checks. This move exploits black's compromised kingside after the pawn sacrifice, aiming to create immediate mating threats and simplify the position into a winning endgame. Black aims to consolidate their material advantage and activate the queen by transferring it to a more central and aggressive square, potentially targeting white's weak king position. This move forces the black king into a mating net by creating a discovered attack on the king and preparing to deliver mate with the rook on the 8th rank. The black king is forced into an even more exposed position, where it will continue to be harassed by the white queen and rook, making further defense difficult. This move forces black's king to repeat its path, allowing white to maintain tactical pressure and prevent black from consolidating their position. White has forced a repetition with the king check, and black's only reasonable continuation is to return the king to the e8 square, avoiding an immediate checkmate threat. The move qc4 aims to create a strong central presence and attack the pawn on a5, potentially forcing weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Black's move of qb7 aims to consolidate the queen and prepare for potential counterplay on the queen side, while white's queen is restricted to the king's side by the passed pawn on d6. This move aims to secure the queen's side pawns and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queen side, while also freeing up the c3 square for a knight if one were available. The move re6 is a defensive maneuver designed to connect the rooks and prepare for potential counterplay, while also safeguarding the vulnerable king. rg1 activates the rook on the king's file, supporting potential kingside advances and preparing for future tactical skirmishes against black's vulnerable king. This move recaptures a pawn and aims to activate the rook on the 7th rank, though it allows white to consolidate their powerful passed pawn on d6. This is a powerful check, forcing the black king into a more exposed position, aiming to initiate a decisive mating attack by opening lines. The rook check forces the black king to the edge of the board, leading to a forced sequence where white sacrifices a rook to deliver a decisive king hunt. This move forces black's king into a passive square, allowing white to consolidate their material advantage and prepare for the final onslaught. The king must seek a safer refuge after the checking sequence, as continuing on the e-file or remaining on the 7th rank would expose it to further checks and potential mating threats from the white rook and queen. This move activates the queen, preparing to either fork the king and rook with qf7 or directly attack the weak squares around the black king after the rook retreats. This rook sacrifice aims to disrupt white's king safety by creating a tactical skirmish, though it allows white to simplify into a winning endgame by recapturing the rook and advancing the passed pawn. This check forces black's king to a more vulnerable position on f6, opening up possibilities for further attacks on the king. This move is a strategic retreat, repositioning the king to a more central and potentially safer square after the forcing checks from white, though it maintains some vulnerability on the queenside. This move capitalizes on white's material advantage and aims to simplify into a winning endgame, though black's active rook poses a persistent threat to white's king. This move repositions the rook to a more active square on the queenside, aiming to support the pawn and potentially participate in queenside play or defend the king if necessary. This forcing check aims to exploit the exposed black king and potentially gain material or create further tactical opportunities by disrupting black's defensive setup and coordinating the white queen and rook. This move forces the black king to a more centralized, but still vulnerable, position, preparing to consolidate white's material advantage and eventually escort the passed pawn. The king repositions to a more secure square, vacating c2 for potential future rook activity and avoiding any immediate checks on the diagonal. The move 47. f6 is a defensive measure to shore up the king's position and create a potential escape square on f7, while also preparing to challenge white's dominant knight on a5. This move repositions the rook to the f-file, aiming to pressure black's vulnerable king and potentially coordinate with the queen for a mating attack or to win material. The move 48. qg7 aims to protect the g7 pawn and prepare for potential counterplay against white's rook on g8, but it doesn't address the immediate threat of white's active rook on f8 nor the impending Checkmate on the kingside. This move forces the opponent's king to a more exposed square, aiming to exploit the king's current vulnerability along the open files. The king is forced to retreat to a more vulnerable square, making it a prime target for further checks and potential mating attacks. This check forces the black king to move, maintaining the pressure and preventing any immediate counterplay for black's weakened kingside.